as I've mentioned to you before, each of the three aspects of experience, so the things you know, the things you don't know, and the fact of yourself, have a very ambivalent underlying structure, both positive and negative, so that the things you don't know are interesting and compelling and the sources of new information, but also the source of the things that undermine you both physically and mentally. And the things you know, of course, your culture disciplines you and shapes you into a full person, but also at exactly the same time molds you and crushes you in a particular direction rather than any of the other directions you might have gone in. And then finally, with regards to the individual, we spent a substantial amount of time discussing the individual's capacity to make order out of chaos, and sometimes to make chaos out of order in the service of a higher order. And that's all to the good. But just like culture and nature have their negative aspects, so do the individual. And I think, personally, this is where Christian mythology in particular comes into its own. I think of all the major religions, Christianity has the most thoroughly developed, what you might describe as formal model of evil. And that model isn't part of the canonical writings of Christianity, say, encapsulated in the Bible, but part of the cloud of sort of natural mythology and storytelling that surrounds the canonical writings. So you could say that although Christianity and Buddhism have spent a substantial amount of time developing up a representation of the hero, Christianity in particular has also spent a substantial amount of time developing a formal portrait of the figure that stands in opposition to the hero. And I think the most appropriate term for that figure, who takes multiple forms in mythology, is the adversary, because the adversarial spirit is a spirit that stands in opposition to everything. Stands in opposition to nature, stands in opposition to culture, and most specifically stands in opposition to that aspect of the human being that's both exploratory and creative. Now, the last time we talked, I had a chance to describe to you how the figures of the adversarial brothers emerge naturally at the end of Genesis as a coda to the story, right? Adam and Eve develop self-consciousness, they develop knowledge of their own mortality and death, and as the primordial parents of humanity, their first children take the form of the hostile brothers, which is to say that if you're the child of nature and the child of culture, the sort of ultimate parents, then as an individual you take two forms, a positive form and a negative form. And the negative form is characterized in many ways by a kind of absolute hatred of the good, hatred of the positive form. And I think that you can't understand the full human propensity for evil without considering more than the territoriality, more than the innate territoriality of human beings. So if you look at animals, well, animals are territorial and they fight to preserve their territory, and it's a rational struggle. They're fighting for resources and for a place that they can operate in, live in, and reproduce in efficiently. But human beings are substantively different from that, in that their agonistic conflict, their aggression, often seems to be motivated by something more akin to the pure desire for destruction rather than for any rational end whatsoever. And so, from that perspective, I would say, as an example, the fact that Hitler ended up committing suicide in a bunker beneath Germany's capital at the end of the Second World War, when Berlin was in flames, when all of Germany was in flames, and when his country was completely defeated after tens of millions of people had died in the conflict, including, of course, the 7 million or so people that were killed in the Holocaust. The normal mode of interpretation of that would be, what a terrible defeat for Hitler, but an equally valid, and I think an equally valid prima facie argument, and one I think that's actually more valid, is that it wasn't a defeat for Hitler at all. It was precisely what he was aiming at right from the beginning, because his mode of being was intensely adversarial. And I would also say that it's certainly possible that the full nature of his motivations weren't even necessarily clear to him. as they unfolded across time during the Second World War, no more than the full motivations of any human being are necessarily accessible to them as they act out whatever it is that they act out. So Carl Jung says, for example, that we act out great mythological stories. That doesn't necessarily mean you know the story, it just means you act it out. So for example, you see people whose lives are repetitive bouts of tragedy, and what they're acting out is a tragic story. And they know it insofar as they're actually acting it out, but they don't necessarily have an explicit model of the relationship between their patterns of behavior and the constantly tragic outcomes they produce. Well, that doesn't even necessarily mean that what they're doing isn't voluntary, because things can be voluntary even if you don't understand them fully. There's an aspect to the human psyche that's a nest of vipers, so to speak, because you can't necessarily trust what you see. And that means not only when you're looking at someone else, say, but even when you're looking in the mirror. You can't be sure that what you say you're doing is exactly what you're doing. Your motivations aren't transparent, and they may not even be clear. So I suppose the idea that lurks behind this formalization is that freedom of choice is such a good that one of its subsidiary necessities, which is that there has to be a polar distinction between good and evil, is worth having. Freedom is so important that it justifies the distinction between good and evil. And I think that's a reasonable way to presume. It's reasonable to presume that that's the manner in which experience is actually structured. And there's complex reasons for that. One would be that under the most optimal circumstances, which is something we'll talk about as this proceeds to a close, that means in a sense you can have your cake and eat it too, which means the potential existence of good and evil allows for freedom of choice. And then if the choice is always towards the good, then you have the benefits of freedom of choice plus the benefits of the good. The only price you have to pay is the constant possibility of evil. It's very much like the structure of Christianity. So you have the highest God whose highest son is Christ, but you have the figure of Satan lurking in the background, who's also got a filial relationship with the highest God. It makes for a confusing kind of theology, because in many situations, of course, Christ is identified specifically with God the Father, but Satan always lurks in the background, and his existential status is indeterminate, because since God is everything, then it's very difficult to make the case that the evil spirit isn't a derivative of God. It's not an easy thing to get straightened out rationally, and I think Milton in Paradise Lost makes a very good attempt to explain exactly what this might mean, how there could be an overarching transcendent power, and there could be two subordinate elements to that, one evil and one good, without destroying the idea that God as such is good, and without eradicating the reality of evil. A very, very complex argument to make. Now, the notion of evil is also a very, very complex idea. So if you look at arguments that support atheism, and I've mentioned some of these, like Ivan's argument in the Brothers Karamazov, where Ivan says, well, the world as such, experience as such, must be evil because it's predicated on the blood of innocence, the suffering of children. The fact that there's vast injustices in the world is indicative that there's no such thing as a good God, or to speak in less personified terms, is evidence that the structure of experience as such is untenable morally. It shouldn't be, because it's predicated on suffering. Jeffrey Burton Russell, who's written a whole series of books on the nature of evil, makes a very clear distinction between different categories of terrible events that I think help bring this into clarity. So imagine this. Imagine first that it's useful to make a distinction between tragedy and evil. Okay, now tragedy is when the bad befalls the good. An earthquake is tragic, or disease is tragic. Now it's easy to regard a disease or an earthquake as evil as well, but the problem with that is there doesn't seem to be any motivation to it. And so it's more reasonable to think something like, well, people are vulnerable. They have to be vulnerable in order to give existence a viewpoint. One of the consequences of their vulnerability is that they're susceptible to tragedy. Okay? If their vulnerability is a precondition for being, then the fact that they're susceptible to tragedy isn't necessarily an evil, it's just a consequence of their limitation. Then you say, well, what constitutes evil if you can't put earthquakes and diseases and so forth into that category? Well, then it seems to be something more dependent on choice. which is the argument that Iliad is making. Say, the world does all sorts of terrible things to people, but it's frequently the case that people act in such a way to make things worse rather than better, right? So if you look at the consequences of the rise to power of the Nazis, for example, it doesn't seem reasonable to put the Nazi concentration camp in the same category from an ethical perspective as the earthquake, right? Because the earthquake is an emergent consequence of the rules that govern physical existence, whereas the Nazi death camp is something that was planned. It didn't have to be. It seems to be an aspect of choice. And this seems to be the idea that's lurking underneath both this mythology and Eliade's comment on it. It's the mere fact that the world is terrible does not mean that it's evil, but then when you look at specifically human actions, there's this aspect of twisted choice that Fry also makes much of. He says if you look at the structure of human history and you try to explain why it has such a bloody and terrible course, it doesn't seem sufficient just to attribute it, say, to the conditions of existence or to ignorance. It seems more like there's a force behind it, so to speak, manifest, say, in every individual, that's actually aiming at the suffering instead of just allowing it to happen, or instead of not stepping in to stop it, but actually aiming at it.